that when you talk about the origin of life, they think, well, that's just part of evolution, right? But in fact, it isn't, of course, because evolution or Darwinism only deals with what happened after life began, but it doesn't tell us anything about life, or excuse me, the origin of life, right? Problem is that many people think that what Miller demonstrated is that you can get life in a test tube, okay? But of course, having an amino acid is not life. It's still just a molecule. It is not, it's not life. And so oftentimes people think, okay, we've shown we can get life. We've shown that life can arise spontaneously, and they think the Miller-Urey experiment has demonstrated that, but of course it hasn't. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are, again, talking about issues of origins. So last week we talked about the origin of the cosmos, and we saw how the scientific evidence that we have today points in the direction of what the scriptures tell us about how God created the universe. And now we want to move on, narrow it down a little bit, and just think today about the question of life. Where did life originate from? And I've got several resources for you up there, several on the internet. That first one, Unlocking the Mystery of Life, is actually it's a DVD, but it's also available on the internet. We'll, given enough time today, we'll watch a little 3-minute clip out of that. It's just a really helpful video or documentary on the subject of life produced by Illustra Media. There's a new book, actually it's a revision and addition to an old book that's been around for about 30 years or so, called The Mystery of Life's Origin, and it's just a tremendous piece of work to explain all the things we're going to talk about today. Then there's this guy, we'll talk about him a little bit today, a guy by the name of James Tour. He's a synthetic chemist, and he's done some tremendous work in this area. He is actually one of the world's leading synthetic chemists. And he's got a video in which he talks about the issue of the origin of life. It's an hour and 30 minutes long. About 30 minutes of it is Q&A. The rest of it is his talk about the origin of life. And then he has a paper, the Animate Versions of a Synthetic Chemist, which a paper that's available on the internet you can read, which talks about some of these things that we're going to be talking about today. There's The Design Revolution by William Dembski. And then there's a really substantial piece of work, Theistic Evolution, a Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. And this is actually a compilation. It's edited by several people, but it's a compilation from a number of different scientists in which they wrestle with these questions of origins and other related questions. But particularly they are critiquing and demonstrating the problems with the idea of theistic evolution. So it's a tremendous piece of work, and it's very helpful in showing the problems there with not only with Darwinism itself, but particularly with a theistic interpretation of Darwinism. So of course, you know the biblical understanding of the origin of life, and really when it comes down to it, everybody's view of the origin of life is rooted to some degree in faith, because nobody was there. Nobody saw it. It wasn't filmed or whatever. So everybody, really, their view of the origin of life ultimately comes down to an issue of faith, and of course it certainly does for us. And Scripture is very explicit about that. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. And then the verse we mentioned last week, all things came into being through Him, that is through Christ. And apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And this, of course, also includes biological life. So back in Genesis, we get, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind with their seed in them. A little further on, then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the ocean, in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed, and their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So there's this tremendous emphasis, particularly in Genesis, but all the way through Scripture, that God not only created the cosmos, but He created life, and He created life in specific forms. Okay, and of course there are it's kind of difficult to define what life is, but there are at least two things that everybody's agreed on that constitute life, or that characterize life, and one of them, of course, is the ability to metabolize things, to get energy to grow and to act and that sort of thing. But the other aspect of life is self-replication. All life is self-replicating, and we get this in Scripture. So the verse we already looked at, plants yielding seed and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. God blessed them, man and woman. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So this idea of replication is explicitly detailed in Genesis. And not only is it replication, but it's replication after its kind. Okay, so plants yielding seed, again, he says after their kind, and again about the beasts and the animals on the earth. Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts on the earth after their kind, and it was so. So very clearly Scripture is teaching us that God created life, that He created diverse forms of life, and that He created them with the ability to replicate themselves, and to replicate specifically after their kind. So this is the biblical background from which we come to this whole question of origins. But when you get to naturalism, when you get to this idea that everything is material, there is no non-material reality, then the naturalist himself has to come up with some kind of explanation for the origin of life. So from a naturalistic perspective, we can refer to the origin of life as abiogenesis. Okay? So using the term in a broad sense, I'll use it in a more specific sense a little later, but in a broad sense, abiogenesis, without, bio, life, and then genesis, beginning. So abiogenesis is the reference to the origin of life from something that isn't living. Okay, so we've eliminated here the possibility of replication. The question is, how do you get the first life? Because when you get the first life, whatever existed before that was not living. It was without bio. It was without life. Okay, so the question is a question of abiogenesis. So when we think about the origin of life, a lot of people, when they think about the origin of life, they have so absorbed and bought into Darwinism or neo-Darwinism that when you talk about the origin of life, they think, well, that's just part of evolution, right? But in fact, it isn't, of course, because evolution or Darwinism only deals with what happened after life began, but it doesn't tell us anything about life, or excuse me, the origin of life, right? So we keep in mind that in Darwinism, the two primary vehicles of Darwinism are random mutation and natural selection, right? So if as you think about it, if you're talking about the origin of life, and if you're trying to fit it into some kind of a Darwinian framework, you've got to have natural selection functioning, all right? But natural selection cannot function without life already existing. You've got to have life. You've got to have life replicating, and you've got to have life having mutations in the replication process in order for natural selection to kick in, all right? So something has to be alive in order for the Darwinian process to kick in. So we can't explain the origin of life by some kind of Darwinian process. So the question then is, if you're trying to, or the point is, if you're trying to explain the origin of life by some kind of Darwinian process, that's just, logically speaking, that's a non-starter, just by the definition of what Darwinism is. But of course, the naturalist doesn't really have much to work with, right? So for a century or so, or 150 years or so, scientists have been trying to figure out how can we account for life. Darwin himself recognized in Origin of the Species that he was not giving an account for the origin of life. So scientists have been trying to figure out, okay, so supposedly we know how we get all these different forms of life, but how did we get the first form, okay? And so what they have to do is they have to come up with some kind of a explanation, and typically their explanations revolve around some kind of random process in the prebiotic world before life, or maybe some kind of, it's not really natural selection in the way we think of it in naturalism, but maybe there's some kind of quasi-natural selection going on in the prebiotic world. So basically you've got kind of two approaches that have been made over the last 100 years or so. So for many decades after Darwin's Origin of the Species came out, for many decades you had scientists trying to account for the origin of life strictly from some kind of random chemical reaction or whatever that occurs with non-living matter. So so the idea was it was just some kind of random, just kind of chance event that happened, and poof, we had life. Okay, but in 1966, there were a number of mathematicians who began to talk to the biologists and say, wait a minute, we've run the math on this, we've run the computer models on this, and there's just simply not enough time to allow for, to compensate for the probability problems that you're facing in what you're suggesting with these kind of random chance events. So they actually had a symposium at the Wistar Institute in 1966 where a bunch of biologists and evolutionists and a bunch of mathematicians got together, and it was just pointed out to the biologists, the math does not work on this, okay? And then, biologists kind of went back to the drawing table and tried to come up with other ways that could have happened by chance. But as those were kind of run through the calculations again, they're running into the same problem. There's just not enough time in the supposed age of the Earth for enough events to happen so that the chance of getting life would actually occur. And then moving forward a little bit further, you get calculations that come from William Dembski, who's a philosopher and mathematician and just a brilliant guy. He actually was one of the speakers at the Science and Faith Conference that we just streamed here a couple weeks ago. And a guy by the name of Doug Axe. And in the work that they have done, for example, is just taking for the sake of the argument that the Earth is, or the cosmos is 13.8 billion years old. So if you just take that at face value for just for the sake of argument. Dembski has calculated that if you count the number of events that occur at the atomic or the subatomic level, okay? So we're not talking about events like going to the grocery store or the birth of the Earth or anything. We're talking about the events that happen at the atomic and subatomic level, okay? What we call elementary particle events, so interactions between atoms and that sort of thing. And you can actually calculate how many of those there were in the supposed history of the cosmos. And he calculates that at 10 to the 139th 139th events, okay? So that's 10 with 139 zeros behind it. That's how many, quote, events have happened in the history of the cosmos if you accept the history of the cosmos at 13.8 billion years of age, okay? But Doug Axe has done calculations on what are the chances if you have a bunch of amino acids and you want to assemble those into a protein. If you just take a moderately sized protein, he says, of 150 amino acids in length, okay? So what are the possibilities if you have 150 amino acids of the 20 types of amino acids that we have in that we have in the human body, for example? If you've got 150 of those, what is the chance just by random event that these will align themselves into a functional protein? And he calculated that at 10 to the 164th power. Okay, so doing the math, it just becomes very clear that the odds against assembling a number of amino acids, assuming you even have amino acids, assembling the number of amino acids into a functioning protein, a moderately sized functioning protein, is just astronomically impossible. So it's just an astronomically big problem, okay? So obviously they weren't going to be able to solve the problem just by attributing it to chance. So the second way to solve the problem is, again, assuming you have amino acids, okay? What if instead of these things just kind of, these amino acids just assembling themselves by random chance, okay? Instead of that, what if there's some kind of necessity involved? What if there's some kind of aspect about the chemicals, some feature of the chemicals that causes an attraction between the chemicals, between the various amino acids, so that they'll align themselves in a particular pattern that would result in a protein. So this is the idea then of some kind of biomedical predestination, okay, or chemical predestination, or some kind of law that's at work. And so those have been kind of the two ways typically that it's been approached. So, but when you come down to it, when you think about the naturalist as he's trying to explain the origin of life, he's facing at least 5 major hurdles. And the first one is he needs to explain fine-tuning. Okay, and we've talked about fine-tuning quite a bit before. So how do you account for the infinitely precise fine-tuning of the universe and of our planet to accommodate for life? The second problem is abiogenesis, and now I'm speaking more in a specific sense. How do you get living organisms arise from exclusively non-living chemicals? Okay? The third problem is the question of proteins or DNA, and this is a chicken or the egg problem. We'll look at all these in a little bit more depth here in a minute. The fourth problem is information. Where do you get the information that lies within the DNA and even other information that is extraneous to the DNA? And then, even if you had all the parts that you needed, if you had all the amino acids, or you had even all the proteins, how do you account for them being assembled? How do you assemble them into some kind of a living organism? And when I'm talking about living organism here, I'm not even talking about a human being, okay, or a giraffe or an elephant. I'm talking about a single-cell living organism. That's what we're talking about. How do you get that first single-cell living organism, okay? So those are the problems. Now I'm going to throw around a bunch of terms, and you're probably all really familiar with them, but let's just go over them anyway just to make sure that we're kind of up to date on them. So we know what DNA is. So DNA is this kind of ladder-like molecule, okay, which has these, look like rungs of a ladder, and then they're all twisted around in this kind of double helix structure, okay? And each rung on the ladder is made up of what are called 2 nucleotides. So there's 4 total nucleotides available, and each one is made up of 2 of those 4 nucleotides, okay? And the precise arrangement of those nucleotides in the DNA molecule are what contain the code or the information in the cell that determines, among other things, determines the construction of proteins, okay? Then, of course, you hear genes talked about. Well, what are genes? Well, genes are just sections of the DNA, right? So you take a particular section of DNA that has a function that does something, so it does a particular thing. In our case, what we're thinking about primarily is the construction of proteins, although there are genes that do other things. So you have these sections of the DNA, and there are 20,000 genes within the human DNA, okay? And then you have RNA over here on the left, okay? And RNA is a string of nucleotides, okay, that are copied from the genes in the DNA. So the RNA is a copy of a section of the DNA, all right? And the RNA, there are a number of different kinds of RNA, but particularly of interest to us today are what are called messenger RNA, which take information from a gene in the DNA, and that information is then transferred in the cell, and you'll see how this works in a minute in the video, is transferred in the cell to determine the arrangement of amino acids that ultimately are constructed into the protein. So amino acids are the molecules that constitute the structure of proteins. Okay. And so you'll get a long chain of amino acids together. They have to be in just exactly the right order. These then are assembled together in order to form the protein molecule. And of course, proteins then are the building blocks of all human life, right? So they make up proteins make up the membranes of the cell. They make up the various machines that do things in the cell. They make up our muscles and our eyes and our hair and everything. So proteins are just absolutely essential then for all of human life. So these are terms that we're going to be thinking about and referring to throughout the talk this morning. So I want to just show about 3 minutes of this video from Unlocking the Mystery of Life that kind of explains some of this.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nucleopore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about here. So going back then to these 5 problems, of course we've talked about this quite a bit before already, the problem of fine-tuning. So why is it possible for life at all to exist on the Earth? So we talked about the fact that our universe and our Earth is finely tuned, and this is actually true at several levels. So for example, there are a number of things about our Earth that have to be exactly right for life to exist. So you have to have the right climate, you have to have the right temperature, you have to have the right atmosphere, you need plate tectonics, you need the right amount of water on the Earth, you need the right tilt of the Earth, all that sort of thing. So many things about the Earth itself. And then there's many things about the universe that need to be exactly right for us to have life. So you've got to have, for example, our Earth has to be in exactly the right place in the solar system, just the right distance from the sun. It has to have larger planets beyond it, outside of it, to protect it from meteors and things like that. And you have to have the solar system in exactly the right place in the Milky Way galaxy. It has to be in a particular place in the galaxy. So all of these things have to be in place in order to have just the first living organism on Earth. But in addition to that, you also have to have certain things set in place at the very beginning of the cosmos. So whether it was a Big Bang or whatever it was, at the very origin of the cosmos, you had to have things exactly right. You had to have exactly the right weak nuclear strength. You had to have the right weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, the force of gravity. All of those parameters had to be set exactly right at the very beginning of the cosmos. That's something that has to be accounted for if we are going to talk about the origin and the sustenance of life on Earth. Okay, so of course we've talked about all of this before, and given that very narrow window of how all of these parameters have to be precisely set, the chance of that just happening just by accident is just astronomically impossible. Okay. So as I said, we've talked about all this before, and again we've talked about how some people have said Well, it's not surprising that we find a life-sustaining universe because we're living, so obviously we'd have a life-sustaining universe. And this is somehow supposed to make it so we don't wonder about the astronomical odds against a life-sustaining universe. It's kind of just to shrug it off and say, well, of course we see a life-sustaining universe. But of course that really misses the point, because of course it's true if you have a living being, a cognizant, conscious living being, he's going to observe a life-sustaining universe, because otherwise he wouldn't exist. But it's false, however, that given the vast number of possible ways our universe could be life-prohibiting, that it's highly probable that by chance alone the universe would be finely tuned to permit us to exist. So while it's true that we will see a life-permitting universe, and that's just a given, that's a tautology, the real question is not why do we see a life-giving universe, life-sustaining universe, but the question is, why does it exist at all? Okay, and that's the question that the naturalist needs to answer. Then the second question, again, has to do with this idea of abiogenesis, and particularly here I'm talking about how do you get life from non-living chemicals. So if all you got on the earth are just chemicals and there's no life, how do you get from non-living matter, non-living chemicals, how do you get to a fully functioning living organism? And of course, for many years the suggestion was somehow this happened in what was called the primordial soup. So back about 100 years ago, this Russian scientist by the name of Oparin suggested that the early Earth was made up of a certain composition of chemicals, and he suggested that if you had these particular chemicals on the early Earth, and then you had some kind of infusion of energy, ultraviolet light or lightning, some form of electricity or something, would zap these chemicals, and then you would get life out of it. And so that's kind of the avenue that many scientists began to explore. And so you get to about 30 years later, you get this graduate student by the name of Stanley Miller. And he's working under the supervision of a guy by the name of Urey, so they call his experiment the Miller-Urey experiment, okay? And so he takes Oparin's suggested atmosphere and he puts it in an apparatus, a pretty fancy apparatus, and he zaps it with electricity, and bingo, sure enough, he gets some amino acids, okay? And that experiment has been repeated many, many times over using various chemicals, different chemicals or whatever, and it's been shown that you can get amino acids from this kind of an experiment, okay? Now the problem is that many people think that what Miller demonstrated is that you can get life in a test tube, okay? But of course having an amino acid is not life. It's still just a molecule. It is not it's not life. And so oftentimes people think, okay, we've shown we can get life, we've shown that life can arise spontaneously, and they think the Miller-Urey experiment has demonstrated that, but of course it hasn't. And Miller didn't claim, in fact, that he had proven it. He'd only proven that you could get amino acids. Well, and it turns out there's bigger problems than that. So one of the problems is that subsequently a lot of geological research has called into question whether there ever was a primordial soup, whether there ever was a massive amount of this kind of primordial prebiotic chemical combination floating around on the earth. And in addition to that, there's been an increasing number of scientists now who have called into question the whole idea of the atmosphere being what Oparin has suggested it was. So the idea that Oparin had and Miller had and many others for many decades was that our atmosphere what is called a reducing atmosphere, okay? But with increasing research, increasing study and that sort of thing, The opinion now is shifting in science that no, it's not. It wasn't a reducing atmosphere. It was an oxidizing atmosphere, or at least it wasn't a strongly reducing atmosphere. It might have been weakly reducing, but there was some oxygen there, or it was predominantly an oxidizing universe. Okay, if you have an oxidizing universe, or even just a mildly reducing atmosphere, not universe, but atmosphere. If you have a mildly reducing or an oxidizing atmosphere, that makes it either impossible to create amino acids by this process, or if they are created, they get destroyed within a short period of time, and there wouldn't be the millions of years or whatever that's supposedly necessary for them to go on then and form into proteins. But even if you allow for a prebiotic soup, okay, so even if you allow for that, and if you allow for the atmosphere, we have to keep in mind that even if you do that, and even if you get amino acids, that's all you've got. You've got the amino acids, but you are still a million miles away from producing a protein, and even many more millions of miles away after you got the protein from producing life. Assuming that you can get proteins in the early Earth by some kind of action like this, the scientists then went on realizing, as I said at the Wistar Institute, that this isn't going to work by mere chance. Then maybe there's some other explanation that doesn't involve simple chance. So they abandoned this effort to just account for it by chance, and they began to explore this possibility that life somehow originated by some kind of necessity or the laws of nature at work. Okay? And so along comes this guy, Dean Kenyon, and you may recognize the picture there because he was the picture that was just on the video we just watched, right? So Dean Kenyon and a companion wrote a leading college textbook in the 1960s, late 1960s, called Biochemical Predestination. Okay, and in that textbook, their suggestion was that these amino acids, once they are created, they don't just align themselves by chance, but there's some kind of chemical attraction between them, okay? And so this would account for how they would then align in just the right way to form proteins. And that was his suggestion. They called it biochemical predestination because it was just the laws of nature and chemistry that dictated how these amino acids would align, okay? But eventually then, Kenyon recognized, wait a minute, with more discoveries about DNA and the coding in DNA, he realized, wait a minute, no, amino acids don't come together because of some particular attraction that draws them together, but they are brought together according to the code that is written in DNA. And so he says, then at a later time, he says, amino acids do not have the ability to order themselves by any biologically meaningful sequence. Or into any biological meaning sequence, all right? So in his conclusion then, the ordering of the amino acids, of course, is a consequence of the code in DNA. It's not a consequence of these so-called attractions or imagined attractions between the various amino acids. So Kenyon then comes to the conclusion that the only way you can get this to happen is through design. So he actually becomes one of the early moving minds, one of the most influential early minds in the intelligent design movement, which is, of course, what you saw him expressing there on the video we just watched. And then there's this guy, James Tour, and I've already mentioned him. Okay, this guy is just an astonishing synthetic chemist. He's won all kinds of awards. He's recognized as one of the leading scientists, particularly in the area of synthetic chemistry in the world. He does happen to be a Christian, a very outspoken Christian. But he, as I say, he's a synthetic chemist. And one of the things they do is they build molecular machines. Okay? So in our video, we saw pictures of these machines within the cell, right, that were doing various things. The ribosome and different machines that were doing different things in cell. And of course, these are just molecular machines, all right? That's what he and his team do. They design molecular machines, synthetic molecular machines, to do various things in industry and things like that. He and his team actually participated in an auto race, an international auto race, in which what they were racing was not automobiles like we think about, but actual vehicles they made out of molecules. So they assembled some molecules together to make these little cars and trucks, okay, at the molecular level. And there was an international competition, and they actually won the international competition racing these molecular cars and trucks, okay? I'm sure you have to be a real geek to appreciate that, right? It's what he does in his spare time. This guy is a genius, okay? And he points out, as I mentioned here, he points out that all living things require at least 4 things. So we've talked about proteins, but also all living things require carbohydrates, they require nucleic acids and lipids in addition to proteins. And he points out the incredible difficulty there is in assembling molecules like that, even in a modern laboratory. And he knows, because he does this for a living, right? He assembles molecules together for a living. And he talks about how extremely difficult it is in a modern laboratory. And he says, from his perspective and from his expertise, he says it's just probabilistically, it's just impossible that this could have been done in the early Earth, where you don't have a modern, sterile laboratory, right? He says, he points out, he says that nature didn't have a sterile laboratory to work in, right? It didn't have any climate-controlled environment. It didn't have a target of what it wanted to do. When he creates something in the laboratory, he knows what he wants. And so as he assembles things, he knows whether or not he's reaching his target. And if he gets so far and then he realizes he's off track, he goes back and he starts over again, right? But if he's going to go back and start over again, what does he do? He goes and gets his notes. And he looks through his notes, and okay, this is what we did, step by step, to get to here, okay? And so he can retrace his steps using his notes. He says, if nature is trying to do this in the prebiotic Earth and it gets so far and it doesn't make it, and it needs to start over and take another, 500 million years or whatever, it can't do that because it doesn't have a notebook. And it doesn't know what it's trying to go to. It doesn't have a target. He said there was no way in the early Earth to prevent cross reactions from other chemicals. So if you get a chemical that's developing and it's moving in this direction, and then but there are also all these other chemicals. He points out, he says, oftentimes people say, well, if you had enough time, but he says, no, time is not always your friend. Sometimes time is your enemy, because chemicals degrade over a period of time. And he just goes on and on and on with all the problems. And so he assesses the origin of life research that's been done, and he says, origin of life research is a retarded field of science. Little has advanced in the field since the highly touted 1952 Miller-Urey experiment. After 2/3 of a century, the world is no closer to generating life from small molecules, or any molecules for that matter, than it was in 1952. One could argue that origin of life research is even more befuddled than it was in 1952, since more questions have arisen than answers. Incidentally, if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can go online. He has talks online. He just finished about a week or two a 13-video series in which he's responding to a critic who has produced a video trying to prove him wrong, and he goes through all the science. The 13 videos, they're like 30 minutes to an hour long each, in which he refutes the critic. So there's just a lot of resource out there for you. So he's arguing that that even if against all these odds that you've got, you get things like carbohydrates and the other essential molecules of every living cell. Even if that were true, you'd still need to build the cell. So you'd have all the parts, you'd still need to build the cell. How do you do that? Okay? That brings us to the third problem, which is the chicken or the egg problem. So this is pretty simple. You need two things in a living organism. You need DNA, as we saw, and you need proteins, all right? The problem is you need the DNA, as we saw, to make the proteins. But the other problem is you need the proteins to make the DNA, right? So the question is, which comes first, right? How do you do that? You've obviously got to have life, you have to have both of those simultaneous. You have to have them at the same time. The fourth problem is the problem again of information. We've talked about this before. Where did the information come from? So in every organism we have two kinds of information. So we have what's called genetic information. That's the information that's in the DNA, that's in the genes in the DNA, right? So there's genetic information. But in the last 20 years or so, we've discovered that there's other information in the cell called epigenetic, that is beyond or outside of the gene, okay? So there's epigenetic information in our cells, and we don't even know where in the cell that information is coming from, but there's clearly things that are happening in the cell that aren't being directed by the DNA or the code in the DNA. That information is in the cell, but it's somewhere else in the cell, okay? So the question is, where is that information coming from? Where are you getting the information that's in the DNA, and where are you getting the epigenetic information? And the fact is, we don't know any material source of information, or any material source of information. So it's true that matter can contain information, and it's true that matter can convey information, right? So I have an outline here, and I get it printed up, and I've got ink on the page. So the page and the ink on the page contains information, and it conveys information to me, but the ink and the paper are not the information, right? They just represent, the ink and the arrangement of the ink on the page represent the information. So the question is, where does that information come from? It doesn't come from matter. There's no material source of information. And as we talked about before, a number of times before, in our uniform and repeated experience throughout human history, we only know of one source of information, and that's mind, okay? So it would certainly seem that the existence of information in the cell is evidence of a mind. And if we're talking about the first living organism, what we're talking about is a mind that exists before the first living organism, okay? And this idea that information arises from a mind is not something that scientists are oblivious to. They're fully aware of it. So the whole science of anthropology is based on the assumption that there are certain things we find as we dig in the earth and we uncover artifacts and things. There are certain things, if we uncover them, we know they came from a mind, right? So science recognizes this. And the billions of dollars, however much has been spent on the SETI project throughout the last number of decades. So we've got all our radar, and they're pointed up into the heavens, and we're trying to detect some kind of radio signal or something from intelligent life. And so what are they looking for? They're looking for some kind of radio signal from outer space that conveys information. And the assumption of the SETI project, the billions of dollars we spent on it, the assumption is if we get information coming from outer space, we will know there is intelligent life in outer space. So we know that information comes from a mind. Where was that? Or who was that mind? Or what was that mind that was there at the beginning of life? And then the fifth problem is, how do you build a house, right? So I give you a pile of bricks, right? And I say, okay, there you go. Give me a skyscraper, right? Okay. Well, the question is, how do you get to the sky? So maybe you have more than the bricks. Maybe you have the steel, and you have the electrical wire, and you have all that stuff, but it's just all piled there, okay? how do you get from that just pile of building materials, how do you get to a fully assembled skyscraper, right? Well, we're dealing with the same thing when it comes to the cell, right? So even if it were possible to get amino acids, even if it were possible, and we've shown that that's highly improbable, even if it were possible to get proteins from amino acids, you've got all these kind of floating around in the prebiotic soup or lying on the ground or whatever in prebiotic. How does that all get assembled into a single cell organism that is then capable of metabolism and replication? Okay, so it just becomes pretty clear that that's just beyond the capability of some kind of natural chance event to occur. So, you know, you might be able to make a brick, but to say I can make a brick is a long way from saying I can make a skyscraper, right? So what all of this is saying is naturalism, in its attempt to tell us how life originated, is just falling completely short of its goal. Okay, it just can't explain it to us, and the evidence seems to be that it never will be able to. That the kind of probabilities we're talking about are so far beyond anything that's even comprehensible that there never will be a scientific explanation for the origin of life. So naturalism doesn't have a viable explanation. But what the scientific evidence does do is it does point us in the direction of an intelligent mind that's compatible with the biblical account. So again, it's not that science tells us who God is or what He's like, but it does point us in that direction, rather than, as most people assume, or many people assume, that it points us away from God. So what science is doing is it's pointing us to an agent as the source of information with the power and the intelligence to assemble the first parts according to information, and according to Scripture, I should say. So that's the origin of life issue, okay? So we talked about the origin of the cosmos and what a challenge that is to the naturalist. Now we've talked about the origin of life and what a challenge that presents to the naturalist or the materialist. So next week we're going to talk about the origin of the species. Once you have life, how do you get this vast diversity of life that we see on the earth today? And of course we know the most common answer to that is Darwinism, or neo-Darwinism as it's called today. And so we're going to look at that whole question of the Darwinian answer to the origin of the species, and we're going to try to discover is that a viable explanation? And of course, spoiler, I don't think it is, but we'll get into that next week. So, okay?